Alrighty, thank you everyone for joining today. A couple of guidelines before we start the webinar. As most of you now know, you are muted centrally, so you can go ahead and munch on your sandwiches and other edibles, and we will not be able to hear you. That's just fine. This webinar will be recorded, is being recorded, so you can watch it later and share it with colleagues. The slides that we will be showing during the webinar will also be available from our website at axiomatic.com. And lastly, we will be saving the last 10-15 minutes at the end of the webinar for a Q&A session. And you can go ahead and use the GoToWebinar feature on the right-hand side to ask questions there directly, and we can see those questions. Today's speakers are, first of all, Jerry Gable, President of Axiomatics Americas, who will be detailing the guidelines inside the NIST ABAC report. And myself, David Broussard, I will be helping out Jerry with some of our customer cases that we see on a regular basis. And Jerry, I'll just hand over to you.
All right. Thanks very much, David. And I'll add my welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar. It's all about this document here, the NIST Special Publication 800-162 Guide to Attribute-Based Access Control Definition and Considerations. And David, we may be going for a record for saying the term ABAC as many times as possible on this webinar. So our objectives today are really to call your attention to the paper. It's, we think, a very significant document. We'll be reviewing some of the contents of it, going through the different sections, and providing some of our commentary, and as David just said, adding some flavor from our own customer experiences. And we think this is a really significant for the industry because both government and private sector organizations look to NIST for various kinds of guidance on different standards and topics. So it's we think it's just really terrific that they put out a paper on ABAC, and it's just the beginning of what we expect from them. We expect them to put out additional work in the future regarding the Center of Excellence and other papers from the NIST group. So we look forward to that as well. All right, we've got quite a bit of material to cover here. And as I said, we'll be pulling out different quotes from the document and commenting on it. Otherwise, David, you know, what we could do is just do a dramatic reading of the whole paper, if you think that would work.
That would be great, Shakespeare style.
Something like that, or maybe not. Maybe we should stick to the format we planned. But anyway, so the objectives of the paper, just two of them, very straightforward. One is to provide a definition of ABAC and describe its functional components. And then there's quite a bit of number of pages dedicated to providing additional guidance on planning, designing, and implementation, as well as operational considerations for readers. And the one quote I pulled out here, it is a first step, right? The NIST team does expect to put out more material on this topic, excuse me, in the future. So we definitely look forward to seeing that as well. So as I said, we're going to go through the different sections of the paper. So we'll start with the executive summary. It does what it says here. It really nicely organizes the number of key themes and topics from the paper. Starting with this one here, talking about traditional access controls based on roles or groups that are directly assigned to users. And then a couple of key comments as well, that practitioners have noted this approach using roles and groups to access control is often cumbersome to manage given the need to associate capabilities directly to users or their roles or groups. And in another example of understatement, it's also been noted that the requester qualifiers of identity, groups, and roles are often insufficient in the expression of real-world access control policies. And it's we have found in reading the document, not surprisingly, of course, that I mean, we use a lot of the same descriptors or characterizations that legacy models just are not up to the task for modern collaboration or data sharing scenarios. Is that what you find as well, David?
Absolutely. And very often I'll tell my customers or our customers it's not just about who you are, but also what, where, when, why, and how. We find that very often. And also, to the second point you have here on your slide, we have customers that have struggled in the past with role-based access control and how roles explode due to the nature of RBAC. When you bring in ABAC, you can more easily manage your access control and make it cheaper to maintain and just more flexible.
Yeah, and I hope we can explore that a bit more as we proceed through the session here. So continuing in the executive summary, another interesting quote here is, of course, they say an alternative to this legacy model is to grant or deny access based on arbitrary attributes of the user and of the object, and as well as the environment that may be globally recognized and more relevant to the policies at hand. So this goes to what you just said, David, that you can implement so much more context because you take more data into consideration when evaluating whether a user should have access to an object or not. And of course, they say here, this approach is often referred to as ABAC. Now, a few things that, along an ABAC timeline coming out of the document, they point back to in 2009 when the Federal CIO Council brought out their FICAM roadmap, the Federal Identity and Credential and Access Management Roadmap. And even in that early stage, it began to advocate the use of ABAC as an authorization model. Then a couple of years later, version 2 of that guidance came out. And in this case, there was a stronger recommendation for ABAC and using that as the access control method, especially when sharing between different organizations. A couple of years ago, then there was another document, this one, the National Strategy for Information Sharing and Safeguarding, which included a priority objective to implement the FICAM roadmap, which of course includes ABAC. I'm not up to speed on what a priority objective is personally, but that sounds pretty impressive, pretty strong recommendation. And then of course the paper that's the subject of our talk today, the NIST guide for ABAC, came out in January of this year after a draft was published last year, late last year, and they took in a lot of comments. I think there was something like 300 or so comments that were offered to the NIST team and the extended group that authored the document, and then they finalized this version in January of this year. And then we'll include a couple of comments from our friends in the analyst community who are also talking about ABAC. Here, the Gartner's prediction that they talked about as recently as March of this year, and Kupinger-Cole, who refers to this market as dynamic authorization, also put out what they call a leadership compass report during this year on the topic. So certainly more and more focus on the ABAC style of authorization out there. So moving on further into the executive summary, there's some other interesting comments that they make here that we wanted to highlight. The access control policies that can be implemented in ABAC are limited only by the computational language that's in the policy language and the richness of available attributes. Certainly true. You can take in any number of attributes. Of course, there's the law of diminishing returns does apply here because you don't want to get too carried away with that. But also that ABAC enables precise control. And this was an interesting topic. David, I don't know if you remember, it came up during a Gartner conference where one of the analysts was talking about the death of least privilege, I think it was called, which started a bit of a kerfuffle on Twitter. But I like the fact then that ABAC enables this precise control because you are giving the exact access rather than just a generic level of access. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And not only is it precise access down to the level of a document or a row in a database or a particular field on a form, but it's also access that depends on environment, as you mentioned in a couple slides ago. And that becomes interesting because it will enable new scenarios such as device-based access control, BYOD, or time-sensitive access control. Absolutely.
Sounds very good. Okay. And then another comment here that, and I use this one actually quite a lot in different presentations. The flexibility of ABAC enables the greatest breadth of subjects to access the greatest breadth of objects without specifying the individual relationships between the two. And this is something that the paper focuses on and reinforces in many places, that you don't have this hard binding or tight binding or tight coupling between subjects and objects that you do in legacy authorization models, and that's what lends itself greatly to its flexibility. And speaking of the breadth of objects, one of the things we wanted to point out is from the study from Hilbert and Lopez a few years ago, looking at how much data is stored digitally. Now you see the curve goes way up here on the right, starting from a very modest amount of less than 1% of information in digital format way back when, but now most data is stored in digital format. And if we superimpose the different modes of access control that we've seen over the years, mandatory and discretionary access control, RBAC, and now ABAC, what we're trying to superimpose here is that because there are so many more objects to secure, we need these more flexible models that can deal with that kind of mass quantity or scale in our application systems. Anything further to add on that, David?
No, I think the graph that you're showing complements extremely well the point that you previously made about the greatest breadth of subject and object. And the paper, the NIST paper, explains the evolution from access control lists to identity-based access control to role-based access control and then to attribute-based access control in a very good way. So I definitely recommend that attendees read the paper for an even more in-depth overview of the evolution of the access control models.
Yeah, good point. We're just hitting some of the highlights here. Now here's a use case example from the paper, and I also use this quite a lot in presentations because I talk about nurse practitioners in the cardiology department can view the records of heart patients. And this is interesting for a number of reasons. The terms highlighted in color here, of course, are the attributes associated with this particular policy or rule. And in the policy language, they end up getting represented by variables, which become quite efficient. And what's also interesting to note here, and that the paper talks a fair amount about attributes, their management and governance. But I wanted to highlight that in many cases, the attributes involved in an ABAC system are actually business data attributes. They're not necessarily defined and managed by the IT organization. So I think that's also a subtle but significant change when you migrate or transition to an ABAC model for access control. And then what I often do is take that example from the NIST paper and then expand it and make it a little more generic and say in this case that nurse practitioners can view records of patients in the same department they are assigned to. And you can start to get a flavor for how flexible these rules can be designed, because now it can apply to all departments in the hospital system. You can add a new department or change names of those departments, and your rules don't have to change because we're just doing comparisons again based on variables. And David, I'm sure you see this in use a lot in customer deployments. In particular, we often find that customers expect to be authoring vast number of policies, but they end up actually with a lot fewer because of these kinds of capabilities.
Yes, indeed. And I think here you're hitting the sweet spot of ABAC. And that sweet spot is relationships. The ability to express the relationship between the subject and the object in such an elegant way, in a rule-based way. And that leads to a very efficient access control model. And let me give you an example from one of our customers. This dates back a couple of years now. And that particular customer from the media sector owned 10 different media brands. And per brand, they have 10 different user roles. And eventually they defined 100 roles because the manager could do certain things within brand one, the editor could do certain things within brand two, so on and so forth. So what happens is with an RBAC approach, with a role-based approach, you get the matrix of possibilities. Role times brand, and then of course it can get even worse if you include the actions. Okay? But in ABAC, instead of having those 100 roles, you ended up with 10 simple rules, a role per brand, and that was a very elegant way of doing it.
Excellent. And again, continuing with the executive summary, a couple other quotes to pull out here. So under ABAC, the way we show this is that access decisions can change between requests simply if you change the attribute values. And this is very important. We do this all the time in demonstrations. We don't change the policy or the rule, but rather we move one person from one department to another, one location to another. And you can see immediately how the behavior of the application changes, or the data that they are able to see changes. And so, of course, this provides a more dynamic access control management capability, and we think it does limit the long-term maintenance requirements for protection of objects. And then the last part of the executive summary we'll mention here are a couple of caveats that they point out, and one is they're a bit concerned about the complexity of implementing an ABAC system, especially across an enterprise or between enterprises, and they cover this in some detail in other areas as well. I think though what that fails to recognize is a couple of things. One is you typically don't go for the big bang approach and think you're going to retrofit, every existing application because of the cost involved, the time required, even the risk of doing all of that. But we find customers take a more opportunistic approach with their ABAC implementations by going for either greenfield environments, custom applications that have are implementing a new API front end, implementing an API strategy, or high-risk applications that just need to be retrofitted because there are compliance concerns that need to be implemented. Does that sound fair to you, David?
Yes, it does. And I would add, by the way, with the caveats, I would call them prerequisites in a way more so than caveats. And also, when you start introducing ABAC within the enterprise, you're realizing that you might have not done all your homework. There are things such as attribute management that you should have had in place anyway, regardless of the use of attributes within ABAC. So introducing ABAC will force you to do your spring cleaning that you should have done anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think it highlights a second thing that we would point out is that the technology itself has a very small footprint, very lightweight architecture, but it's really around the business process side of things, as you just pointed out. Actually documenting all of the access rules, knowing where the attributes are that are going to be used in those policies, and managing the governance of them from that perspective. I think those are some of the harder things to accomplish sometimes, and I think that's typical across many identity management disciplines. When you think of user provisioning or single sign-on or federation, we often point to those non-technical aspects of the project.
Right, and as a matter of fact, Jerry, if I can jump in again, where we have seen the most success in customer organizations is places where they had a clear data strategy or a clear API strategy, because it meant that contracts had been clearly defined between a consumer and a service, and we knew exactly, or the customer knew exactly, which attributes they were dealing with, what the interfaces were, what methods would be called, what the input would be, what the output would be. In those cases, it's extremely quick, it's extremely easy to apply ABAC to those strategies, to both data strategies and API strategies.
Right, good point. Okay. Well, now we're ready to move to section 2 of the document. Just doing a time check here. It doesn't look too bad, all right? One thing they point out is that EXACML, the Extensible Access Control Markup Language, is an example of an ABAC system, which we're, of course, agree with. And I just highlight here also the elements that the paper points out are parts, the modular parts of an ABAC system are also consistent with what terminology EXACML uses. EXACML didn't invent these terms of policy enforcement point and decision point and so on. They actually come from prior work, but the ABAC paper also utilizes these terms. And in section 2.1, they talk a little bit about benefits of ABAC, and they've mentioned some of this, of course, in the executive summary, but just to reinforce here, they also talk a lot about subjects that are not associated with the organization, so the unanticipated user from an outside entity. So it's a lot easier to work in federated environments with ABAC than it was with previous models. And of course, the ABAC is much more expressive and can support multi-factor decisions. David, you mentioned things like bring your own device. What kind of device is being used to access this data? Is it registered with the organization, or is it managed and issued by the organization? So all of those kinds of things can be taken into account. And then, of course, the fact that ABAC avoids the need to assign explicit authorizations to a subject before access is attempted. Again, this gets primarily to the federated use case. And on this slide here in section 2.2, they provide a definition for ABAC, which it sounds reasonable to us: an access control method where subject requests to perform operations on objects are granted or denied based on assigned attributes of the subject, of the object, environment conditions, and the set of policies that are specified in terms of those attributes and conditions. Exactly what we might describe it in different terms or different words slightly, but certainly spot on definition.
And Jerry, if I may jump in, there's a couple of things that jump out of this definition that are extremely interesting. First of all, and I know you'll get to that point, it's a policy-based system, which means that the business requirements will be better reflected into the technical artifacts. That's one aspect. The second aspect is the environment or the context can now play a part in the authorization. That's extremely interesting, as we already mentioned. And the third aspect that's extremely interesting is that you can now express negative rules, negative aspects, whereas in the past, access control lists and role-based access control were pretty much essentially about positive cases, granting people access to resources. Today, you can actually deny access to resources and objects based on different attributes, and that's a very novel part of the access control model.
Good points. Thanks. All right, next up in 2.3, the paper explores more of the basic concepts of ABAC, and a couple of things to point out here on the second line, that subjects and objects are assigned appropriate attributes. Of course, they have to come from somewhere, so that means on the object side that you have some kind of data classification, or you just have a data model associated with those objects. For example, we see cases where certain records within a banking system can only be viewed by people within the country that the customer is also domiciled in. So you need to have that kind of data model available, and associated to the resources you're looking to protect. Those attributes aren't necessarily stored with the content itself, right? They could be in a separate directory or database table. They could somehow be incorporated by reference or even managed in another application. So the objects can actually be sourced from a number of different areas. They don't actually have to be within the data element itself or even within the subject itself. Anything further there to add, David?
Nope, all good.
Okay, good. Moving along then, 2.4, they expand this now to look at enterprise ABAC concepts. Okay, so getting beyond the basics. And here again, that they focus on the potential for ABAC to get more complex. And that, I mean, that's complex is sort of a negative term here. We would say get more comprehensive as well, because obviously an ABAC system is much more comprehensive and sophisticated than ACLs or a role-based approach. But I think in this slide here, what's important to point out is that with ABAC, you have the opportunity to implement a clean separation of concerns so that you have elements focused on authorization, and they can be handled independently of something like authentication, where an organization can change the type of authentication they use based on the constant change of threats to that kind of technology. And we think this slide takes sort of more of a legacy view and incorporates elements that artificially make it look complex, like dealing with authentication or user provisioning or credential management. This other graphic that they use in the document showing the core elements of an ABAC system, we think is much less complex and gives a more appropriate view of the system, albeit we recognize it does integrate with other elements in the infrastructure. All right, next we have a section on policy, enterprise policy, and some other subsections here. And they talk a lot in the paper about natural language policy, and that of course it has to be codified into digital policy or machine readable policy. And David, we often run into this, when we're thinking about policy modeling or structuring the access rules within an ABAC system. Where do you start? Well, we like to say, well, we want to start with the English language statements of here are the conditions for access to medical records or to the investment banking records or to insurance claims records. Here's the English language statements, and this is what sometimes is not clearly documented, and we have a challenge to derive that, and then to make sure that we can actually represent it in the digital policy or the machine readable policies.
Yes, indeed. So on the one hand, you have the challenge that you need to gather the requirements and have everyone agree on them. That's one challenge. And that's a challenge that you have to do independently of any ABAC system. You need to know what your natural language policies will be, on the one hand. On the other, once you know them, you want to analyze them, understand the building blocks of those natural language policies. Those building blocks will be attributes in the ABAC world. And then, of course, once you have the building blocks, you need to understand who manages them, where they come from, how you retrieve the values, and potentially define additional metadata such as the governance of those attributes. If you go back to the nurse example that you had before, the nurse practitioner, you said that nurse practitioners could view medical records in a given department. Well, nurse practitioner, what is it? Is it a job title? Is it, excuse me, is it a role? Who manages that attribute? Where does it come from?
Right, and then an example is a way that we can represent these natural language policies as digital policies, right? And using the alpha language, which is an abstraction over XACML itself. An alpha, by the way, for those of you that don't know, is something that Axiomatics created, but we're contributing to the OASIS technical committee, so it's actually going to become a profile on the Exactable standard in hopefully the near future. And I also should give a shout out to our friends over at NMed, who deal a lot with natural language policy and are working to convert a constrained natural language into Exactable itself to help facilitate this process. It's interesting to see how over the years developments and research in that area is coming to the fore and actually getting to the point where it can be implemented as part of an ABAC system. Okay, next up, attribute management again. Here, some interesting comments are made that, of course, the attributes need to be named, defined, and given a set of allowable values, assigned a schema, and so on here. The same thing for subject attributes and object attributes. And David, this is something we use an internal dictionary for that we find is quite useful. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yes, of course. So as part of the policy modeling and the policy authoring within our solution, we do have a dictionary where you can define your attributes, their identifiers, their namespace, their range of potential values, and that could be just a list of values, say a list of state codes, or it could be a pattern, for instance, a pattern of allowable values. And the idea is that the more metadata you add about your attributes, the richer your model is, and then the better, of course, your policies will become, and in the long run, the better the auditing of these policies will become.
Right. And I think one thing the paper seems to assume or imply is two things, actually. One is that IT is managing all of these attributes. And as I said earlier, a lot of the attributes actually will come from the business application directly, so they're not under IT supervision, if you will. The other thing is that they seem to apply that the ABAC system itself will manage some number of attributes, which of course it does not, and we get into that a little bit later about sources of external attributes. And as it says here in the second quotation, that there actually can be multiple authorities for different attributes. The HR system, a customer relationship system, an enterprise directory. So there's definitely the potential for different authoritative sources for attributes. Okay, next topic here, 2.4.3, is the access control mechanism, or they refer to ACM, and how it's distributed across the enterprise. And we see this a lot with customers as well, that they implement a shared service that many applications connect with. They can implement more of a distributed model where it's organized according to line of business or maybe geography, or yet again, they could even distribute the policy engines that enforce the ABAC model within applications. So there's a number of ways that the ABAC system can be deployed. Care to share anything further on that, David?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that, Jerry. Jerry, did we lose you?
Sorry, do you care to share anything further? Yeah, no, just for a second. Do you care to share anything further about how the policy engines can be distributed, either shared or in a central model or distributed within applications?
Well, just the fact that because the architecture both in ABAC and in XACML XACML has been done so well, and because there's a clear decoupling between the management of the authorization policies, the decision-making process done at the decision engine, and the enforcement, it means that you can actually apply the same consistent fine-grained authorization in many different locations in the enterprise while still managing the policies in a central fashion, centrally. And that is a great achievement. And one other thing I would want to point out is that the architecture in itself is not new from either ABAC or XACML, but it predates both models. So it's a very mature architecture.
Right. Okay. Great point. Thanks. All right, next, we'll move on to section 3. It's ABAC enterprise considerations. It's a pretty lengthy section, so we'll hit some of the topics here. What they do is they go through each of these 5 areas. That's the NIST system development lifecycle, and they point out things to consider in each of these topic areas. So if we start in the first section, in initiation, they go through a discussion of building the business case for ABAC. And this is pretty sound advice. Before you get too far ahead of yourself, you need to understand the different kinds of requirements for ABAC, whether they exist in your organization, whether you're ready for that, whether you have the the technical and business maturity to go in this route. And this is, I think, typical consulting guidance that you would get from most system integrators or identity management consultants. And that they also mentioned here that it may be more practical to take an incremental approach and use and implement ABAC protections for a limited set of objects or a limited set of applications. And as we mentioned earlier, we certainly see that to be the case more often than not, that there's a specific set of or subset of applications or resources that need ABAC protections. And some of the prominent business cases that we see from customers are around secure collaboration. This need to share data, which is a significant shift in mentality from the need to protect or data. It's more of taking an approach to open up access to data and facilitate the business collaborations that take place in complex organizations today. There's also the need to, as you open up more access, to balance the the security and the risk involved, and that's something that an ABAC systems can certainly help with. And then another area that often is used in a business case justification is of course compliance and governance. It seems like we can never get away completely from the compliance requirement, and we see that coming up more and more from a privacy perspective, both here in the US and in particular for financial institutions that work in multiple jurisdictions, because more and more they're being tasked with implementing not only region but even country-specific privacy rules. So we see that as being a big justification for investing in an ABAC approach. Okay, next up.
2 quick points, Jerry, on your previous slide. First of all, one of the other use cases that we see is customer enablement or customer self-service in the retail banking or in the health insurance sector or in, as a whole, the insurance sector, being able to build portals where you can let your customer decide what they want to do with their information and still apply fine-grained access control. That's another big use case that we see. And that another point I want to make is that historically in the past, IT has dictated the business what they can or cannot do based on the limitations and the capabilities of software. But today with ABAC, you can turn that around and the business can finally tell the IT team, oh, we want to do this, we want to do that, and ABAC is going to enable the business. So it's putting the business back into control of what they want to do.
Excellent. Thanks for adding that in. Okay. Next one. Did I miss a slide here? No, we're still on track. So 3.1.2 is scalability, feasibility, and performance. So here they point out some of the potential issues because you're implementing these ABAC components potentially throughout the enterprise and sometimes across organization or network boundaries. So you have to think about latency, the potential for latency between some of these components. And that's something we often get involved with evaluating and analyzing with customers. And there's a number of ways to mitigate performance and scalability concerns. And maybe, David, I'll ask you to talk about a couple of those here in the next minute or so.
Sure.
As in right now, sorry.
Sorry about that.
This is what happens when you're 6,000 miles away from each other.
I know, they're blame it on the system, it's never the human's fault. Right. So the ability for our solution and for ABAC to scale is extremely good because of the stateless nature of the system. So you can very quickly add on new authorization engines to be able to cater for new applications, to be able to cater for new scenarios. Also, it's not just about the technical performance, but it's also about the expressiveness of your policies. Not only can you cater for one use case, but you can cater for a second use case and cater for a third use case and combine them all into a single authorization engine that you can manage at the enterprise level.
All right, great. Thanks. Next up, development and maintenance cost. And we've alluded to this a couple of times, but here they say the cost of retrofitting applications to use ABAC is wholly separate from procuring, setting up, and maintaining the authorization infrastructure. Of course, same for any other kind of identity management software. The licensing of the software itself is going to be separate from all of the tasks associated with implementing that software. And the next statement here, the benefits of having more precise, consistent, and flexible security must be quantified and used to determine the right balance between cost of risk and cost of security. Of course, that's sort of motherhood and apple pie kind of statement. No argument there. The next section, they talk about the cost of transition to ABAC. And here they're referencing or looking more at the change to habits and behaviors or new processes, maybe that need to get integrated into the day-to-day life of your employees or customers or partners. Also, the second point here, that users will need to be educated possibly on the new ABAC system and processes. And also that users may be, I think it should be uncomfortable, or I'm sorry, users may be comfortable with existing processes and may not see an immediate value in switching to ABAC. And I guess this is always a concern when you have a significant change in technology for users, whether it be single sign-on or automated user provisioning or password synchronization. I suppose there are cases where even with ABAC that you need to have this kind of awareness or training, particularly in scenarios where if you have legacy applications that permit access to all data when the user logs on, and we still find many of these, and then all of a sudden you implement ABAC, and now when they are using the system, they just don't see as much data as they used to, and so they think something is wrong. So from that perspective, some awareness or training is certainly needed to demonstrate or to show that this is actually a benefit. There's nothing wrong with the system. Next up, David, I want to talk about the section here, and I'll ask you to comment on this one for sure, the need to review privileges and monitor authorizations. So in the paper, they seem to say that in an ABAC system here, particularly the last comment, that an ABAC system may not lend itself well to conducting these audits efficiently. And that is an audit to determine who does have access to objects or other resources. And they talk about before the fact audit is often necessary to demonstrate compliance to specific regulations and directives. And we certainly see this as a requirement for an ABAC system. And maybe you can address how we've dealt with being able to analyze policies in this manner.
Right, so that's what I like to call understanding the world of the possibles, what can happen, what cannot happen in your ABAC-driven environment. And what we've done is we've developed a new technology called reverse querying, which lets you look at your authorization policies and look at a set of known information, a set of known attributes, and understand based on that information what could happen. So with our technology, for instance, Jerry, you could say, given that I know that I'm dealing with a manager, what can that manager do? And the system would reply, oh, managers can view documents so long as the documents are secret and located in Arizona, for instance. And the great thing about ABAC is that since it's based on attributes, in a way, all attributes are created equal, which means that you're auditing your reporting of the possible or the before the fact audit, as it's called in the NIST report, can focus on users. So what can a manager do? Or more specifically, what can Alice do? Or what can a manager in Utah do? But it can also focus on the resources. So who can access a given resource? Or it could focus on the action or the environment or a mixture of these. So you could even create audit reports that say, what can managers do on documents located in Utah between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m.? So you can be as broad or as specific as you like in those audit reports. And we find that the quality of such reports is such that it's enabled, it's led to more secure systems, if you will.
And indeed, and I think this has been a real challenge for ABAC systems in the past, where the only other way to get those kind of reports was to actually run a massive script that tests every possibility. And it's great that we've been able to come up with a technique to actually do that analysis rather quickly.
Jerry, do you mind if I jump in with a live question from the audience, because it's spot on with this slide?
Right.
So the question here is, what about history? Who had access 2 years ago? You have to store all the attributes in the policies at that point in time. And it's a very good point, as a matter of fact. If you want to do the before the fact audit, you do have to keep time in mind, because it's extremely easy to keep a version of your policies. So you could store your policies from today and the policies from the day before and so on and so forth. You can do version control on your policies. That's extremely easy. But doing version control on attributes is not so easy, and it would lead to an explosion of attribute values, really. Which means that if you do want to achieve history, one of the easiest ways, of course, is to run your reports on a regular basis. So you run every month or every quarter, what can a manager do, so on and so forth. And you define those reports and you run them on a quarterly basis. And therefore, you have your history achieved that way.
Right, but also in the audit log, you do have a record of what did happen. And within that audit log, you can, if I'm not mistaken, also capture what attributes were used in a policy evaluation. So
yes,
you do
indeed.
have that history log to trace back what did happen and why and how it occurred the way it did.
Correct. And if you combine the two together, you get a pretty good overview of what was possible and what did happen.
Exactly. Great. Okay. Yeah, please do jump in with other questions if you think they're appropriate. Okay, next subsection here, understanding object protection requirements. And this section here explores a little bit further about documenting the requirements for this, because of course you need to know what the requirements are for object protection. These are the conditions for access, for granting it or denying it. And they also say that they recommend the Enterprise ABAC implementation be initially applied to objects that are well-defined, controlled, and documented. Wish that were the vast majority of objects within an organization, but I think, David, we agree with this. This is a good place to start to get a quick win to establish your first ABAC implementation.
Absolutely. You want to go little by little and grow from there.
Yeah, and then another way to get started I often hear you talking about is if the organization has an API strategy, because that's again a relatively lightweight and unintrusive implementation model. Care to talk about that a little bit more?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, Jerry, please?
Yeah, about an API strategy, that's a really good place to get started as well.
Yes, so it is indeed for two main reasons. On the one hand, technically it is extremely easy to integrate at an API level. So if you're thinking about products like Apogee, CA Layer 7, Axway, Data Power from IBM, so on and so forth, it is very easy for us to plug in to extend their gateways with an authorization engine such as the Axiomatic Policy Server. That's the technical side of things. And then the business side of things, which is even more interesting, is that when you define an API, you've actually defined the contracts of that API. the methods you'll expose, what they will do, what the processes behind those APIs will be, and perhaps even more importantly, the messages you will be exchanging through those APIs. So if, for instance, you're delivering a new health insurance API where you have a method called claim policy, then in that method you would have defined what a claim is, what an insurance policy is, what a customer is, and all these are steps, prerequisites to being able to implement your ABAC. But if you know that you're dealing with a claim, then you know that a claim has a value field, you know that a claim has an owner field. And then, of course, the customer object is the same. You know the customer ID, you know their social security number, you know their location. All these parameters of your API strategy will then in turn become attributes of your ABAC policies.
Excellent. Yeah, we see that so often. It's a great place to get started. Okay, next up in the initiation phase still, enterprise governance and control. And here in the first comment, they're recommending an enterprise governance body, and I think this recommendation also applies when organizations are undertaking any kind of major identity management initiative. So that you have a group that's determining some of the processes and internal policies that will be followed, so that you can ensure there's a group to manage and oversee this kind of project and implementation and operation going forward. And within this section, they also describe a number of different kinds of trust chains. That is, the connections between different kinds of components in the system within the enterprise and without. So there's a lot of discussion of that, and I think also this is where an attribute governance model would apply. And here again, it's more about process than technology, because as we've mentioned here multiple times, the attributes used in ABAC are privilege granting attributes, and of course they should be managed appropriately, that there's a change control process for them, that there's an authoritative owner for each of the attributes, and so on. That's certainly an important aspect about the system, because you don't want to start rolling out an ABAC system and then just you start using attributes from the enterprise directory if you don't know its availability, if you don't know who's actually managing the accuracy and the consistency of that data.
That's a very good point, Jerry. And we have seen cases where customers would use attributes that they had not checked the governance of, and they would later realize that they should have not used such attributes because they were not clearly being governed.
Mm-hmm. Certainly an issue to be aware of. And then they talk more here in this section about an attribute architecture, and I think this refers back to a previous conversation we had about that all of the attributes need to be defined, established, and constrained, and so on, and then that the schema must be made available to different parts of the system, as well as users that will manage this data. And I think this refers back to our discussion about using the dictionary to help make that a consistent model.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, moving along here. I see that we're running a bit short of time. The next section here is around the acquisition of the technology, and here they go through a list of different topics here. A lot of this is around business process generation, as they point out, and we actually have something similar. We call it getting started with ABAC. It's some of the basic steps that you would go through to start planning and implementing an ABAC system. And then in the next section, they talk about a number of topics around integration with other identity management systems, dealing with the integrity between components, selection of attribute sources. So again, some pretty typical implementation or planning steps that we would agree with for the most part. Some more considerations here. I think there are about 13 or 14 of these considerations in the system development and acquisition state, and it just as a slightly different angle on some of the topics they've brought up in previous parts of the paper. Then just a couple more slides, some considerations during implementation. This is around attribute caching that's seen as a very useful mechanism for dealing with some performance concerns in certain scenarios. They also reference attribute source minimization. This is a great place where a virtual directory comes into play to aggregate and consolidate data from lots of different sources for the ABAC system. And then some commentary about interface specs, and so that application programmers and others know what APIs are available that they should be using. And then lastly, some more attention to the quality of data and assurance of data is even brought up in this paper, and further comments about high availability and resilience of the ABAC service, because now, of course, it's an important part of your application environment. So that's really a review of the ABAC paper by NIST. Again, a great document. Highly recommend that you check it out and read it. There's a lot of additional information in there that we weren't able to cover just due to time constraints today. Within the slide deck here that we'll publish, we've also got a few notes on events that we'll be at, both CA World and the Gartner IAM conference, both in Vegas later this year, and some additional reading materials for you to check out. And David, I don't know if I'll let you tell me if there are any particular questions in the queue that you want to address now, or if we should suggest we'll follow up by email with those questions.
So there's about a dozen questions or so that they're all really interesting, but perhaps I'll ask you one, Jerry, that I've replied to already, but I want to see your take on it. So at some point we said that ABAC is the chance to actually put the business back in control. So one of the auditors asks, is the business ready to take the responsibility? They still like to point to IT if something goes wrong. What's your take on that, Jerry?
Wow, that is a great topic, because we mostly hear from the IT group that they don't have the bandwidth nor the expertise really to author these ABAC policies because they are so business specific. So they always look for tools that can enable the business owners, be it a business analyst or that type of person, to be the policy author, at least the initial author. And then of course IT takes care of putting that into production in those aspects. It's interesting that the business owners are trying to defer responsibility, because ultimately they have the responsibility, and they at least should know what the risks are for allowing certain kinds of transactions to execute, or what the conditions are for proper access to data within their domain. I think the domain expertise is absolutely essential in creating the ABAC rules, and it may be just a matter of getting those rules documented just in English language format to start with. I hope that comports with your response.
It does, Jerry. It does. We always speak with one voice, or nearly. And I just want to point out that a great example of what you just described is available online. If you look at the HL7 policies that are described on the HL7 wiki site, they're a great example of ABAC policies. And as a matter of fact, the authors of the ABAC NIST report do point out to HL7 as an example. So I do recommend that attendees check out the report and also check out HL7 as a healthcare example, at the very least, as an inspiration for other use cases.
Very good. And I guess then we'll have to close it there, David, due to time constraints. What we'll promise to do, though, is go through the questions and provide direct answers to those. And with that, we thank you very much for attending. We hope you found this useful, and look forward to seeing you on our next webinar or at the next conference. Take care, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jerry. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.